The millionaire's mother humiliates her son's poor girlfriend at a gala, hoping to teach him a lesson. But the lesson she learns changes her life forever. Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Stay tuned until the end, things are about to get intense. Now, let's get into it. The morning sunlight filtered through the high, vaulted windows of the Marshall estate, casting an elegant glow on the polished marble floors. Ethan Marshall stood in front of his large bedroom mirror, adjusting his tie for what felt like the 100th time. His suit, a crisp, charcoal gray, was immaculate, just as his mother, Vivian Marshall, insisted it should be. Ethan was the face of Eco-Power Solutions, a company at the forefront of sustainable energy. The public saw him as a confident, successful executive, but behind that composed exterior, Ethan often felt like a puppet, his strings held tightly by his mother's unrelenting grip. He tightened his tie one last time, hearing the familiar sound of heels clicking across the marble floors outside his room. She was coming. The door opened without a knock, and there she stood. Vivian Marshall, poised as ever, dressed in a tailored navy suit that screamed control and dominance. Her presence filled the room before she even spoke. The scent of her expensive perfume lingered, sharp and purposeful, just like her. "Ethan, darling, the blue tie would have been a much better choice," she said, her voice calm but commanding. She crossed the room swiftly, reaching up to straighten the lapel of his jacket as if he couldn't manage it himself. "Remember, today is important. The investors will be looking to you for confidence, leadership, and above all, stability." Ethan resisted the urge to sigh. Stability. Her favorite word. Stability meant no risks, no deviations from the carefully constructed path Vivian had designed for him since he took over at Eco-Power. Every decision, every movement, had to align with the family's legacy. "I've got it under control, Mom," Ethan replied, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He had spent hours preparing for this investor meeting, but not in the way Vivian wanted. He had something different in mind, something more authentic, more him. But, of course, she didn't see it that way. She never did. "Do you?" she asked, raising one perfectly arched eyebrow. Her skepticism was palpable. "You'll be using the speech I drafted, won't you?" Ethan hesitated for just a second too long. "Ethan," she said in a tone that was sharper now, laced with disappointment. "This isn't the time for one of your improvisations. Stick to the plan, or you'll come across as uncertain. The investors need to know you're reliable, that the Marshall family has everything under control." He wanted to tell her that he was reliable, that he could handle this without her interference. But that argument had been lost a long time ago. Instead, he nodded, swallowing the frustration that threatened to rise. "I'll be fine," he said softly. "I'll make sure everything goes smoothly." Vivian smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was more of an approval of compliance. "Good boy. Now, I'll meet you at the office in an hour. Don't be late." With that, she swept out of the room, her heels clicking their rhythm of authority once again. As soon as the door closed behind her, Ethan exhaled deeply and leaned against the edge of the dresser. The man staring back at him in the mirror was polished, groomed, and perfect, but it wasn't who he wanted to be. Not anymore. Not in the ways that mattered. The truth was, Vivian hadn't just molded his career. She had her hands on every aspect of his life. The business. His personal decisions. His relationships, or lack thereof. Every moment of his day seemed to be dictated by her unwavering plan for the Marshall family legacy. And Ethan, well, he played his part. He had to. But today, for the first time in years, Ethan felt the urge to do something different. He didn't want to stand in front of those investors and repeat the same old lines about solar panels and wind turbines, reading from a script Vivian had carefully crafted for him. He wanted to speak his mind, to show them who he really was, and the vision he had for Eco-Power, a future built on innovation, risk, and meaningful change. He didn't know how long he stood there, wrestling with his thoughts, but eventually, he shook his head and grabbed his briefcase. As much as he hated to admit it, he wasn't ready for that fight. Not yet. Downstairs, the house was as quiet as always. Too large, too cold, and too meticulously designed, just like the woman who lived in it. Ethan preferred the times when he was away from it all, when he could escape the confines of his perfectly ordered life and find some peace. But those moments were fleeting. "Mr. Ethan," came the voice of Jenkins, the family's longtime driver, as Ethan stepped outside into the bright morning air. Jenkins, as usual, was waiting by the sleek black sedan, the door already open. "Morning, Jenkins," Ethan said, sliding into the back seat. "Good morning, sir," Jenkins replied. "Shall I take you directly to the office?" "Not yet," Ethan said. "Let's stop by the shelter first." Jenkins nodded without question, as he always did, and started the car. The shelter wasn't part of Ethan's regular schedule, but it was a place that offered him something he rarely found in his pristine corporate world, a sense of groundedness. The people there didn't care about his suits, his company, or his last name. They cared about the food donations he brought, the resources he helped fund, and the moments of conversation he shared with them. It was where he met Lena. The drive was short, but long enough for Ethan's mind to drift to the pressures awaiting him. The shelter was a brief respite, a place where he could at least pretend to be something other than Vivian's perfectly polished air. Jenkins parked in front of the modest building, and Ethan stepped out. As soon as he walked through the doors, the noise of the bustling shelter greeted him, children's laughter, volunteers moving around with purpose. And there was Lena, the heart of the place, moving swiftly between tasks, her energy and warmth palpable even from a distance. She didn't notice him at first, too busy helping a young boy tie his shoelaces. But when she looked up and saw Ethan standing there, a soft smile spread across her face. "Back again?" she asked, wiping her hands on her worn apron. "Yeah," he said, smiling back, feeling a little more at ease. "I couldn't stay away." Lena chuckled, moving to the front desk to grab a clipboard. "Well, we're always happy to have you." For the first time that morning, Ethan felt like he wasn't just following orders. Here, in this humble, busy place, he wasn't just the heir to a family empire, he was simply Ethan. Ethan pushed open the door to the shelter, the familiar sound of children's voices and the bustle of the staff filling the space. The air inside always had a warmth that was missing from the pristine, cold offices of Eco Power. This place wasn't about numbers or strategies. It was about people, and that was something he had always been drawn to, though he barely allowed himself to admit it. As he stepped inside, a small child rushed past him, giggling and clutching a stuffed bear, his face lit up with pure joy. Ethan smiled, though it was fleeting. His mind was still clouded by the confrontation with his mother earlier. It lingered like a weight in the back of his mind, dragging him down. He wasn't ready to face the day's demands yet, and so here he was, trying to find some clarity in a place where none of the usual pressures applied. Then he saw her. Lena, standing by the supply room door, a clipboard in hand, her dark hair tied up in a messy knot. She wore a simple t-shirt and jeans, clothes that spoke more of functionality than fashion, and yet, there was something about her, something unpretentious. He'd met her a few times before, but she hadn't been anything more than a friendly face in the background of his visits. Now, as she moved through the shelter, giving directions to volunteers, checking inventory, and making sure everything was running smoothly, she seemed like the heart of the place. A steady, quiet force that kept everything together. She noticed him, gave a small wave, and walked over with a smile that felt like the first genuine thing he'd seen all day. "Ethan," she said, tucking the clipboard under her arm. "You're back again. Are we that irresistible?" Her tone was light, but there was something else behind her eyes, an understanding of why people like him might seek out a place like this. "I guess so," he replied, shrugging with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's nice to get away sometimes." She nodded, looking over at the children playing in the corner of the room. "I get it. It's a different world in here. A little chaotic, but it's real." Real. The word hit him harder than he expected. In his world, real was a luxury, a thing that had to be carefully curated and displayed. But here, it just was. Unvarnished, messy, but honest. What's going on today? Ethan asked, trying to focus on anything other than the tight knot of anxiety that had formed in his chest after his conversation with Vivian. Nothing out of the ordinary, Lena said, her voice laced with affection as she looked around the room. We've got a big food delivery coming in, so I'm wrangling volunteers to help with sorting. The kids are having a bit of a rough morning, but that's not unusual. He watched as she moved through the space, completely at ease in her surroundings, hands-on with everything and everyone. There was no distance between her and the people she helped, no walls separating her from their struggles. It was something Ethan couldn't relate to. In his world, those walls were everywhere. You run this place like you've been doing it forever, Ethan said, watching her settle a dispute between two of the younger children with patience and a kind word. Lena laughed lightly. Feels like forever some days, but it's only been a couple of years. I started working here when I was in a tough spot myself. It wasn't easy growing up, and I know what it's like to feel like you don't have options. This place helped me get back on my feet, and now, well, it's my turn to help. Her words hung in the air, simple but full of meaning. Ethan shifted on his feet, feeling a pang of something unfamiliar. Guilt? Maybe. He didn't know what it was like to not have options. His life had been nothing but options, every door opened by someone else before he even had a chance to knock. But that safety net felt more like a trap these days. You must love it here, he said, and he wasn't sure if it was a statement or a question. I do, she said, her eyes softening. It's not glamorous or easy, but it's real. These kids, the people who come through here, they need help. And I need to feel like I'm doing something that matters. Something that matters. The words echoed in his mind. Did anything he did at EcoPower really matter? Sure, they pushed the boundaries of renewable energy, and yes, the company was successful. But what had he done that truly made a difference? What had he built on his own, without the safety of his last name propping him up? What about you? Lena asked, interrupting his thoughts. Running a big company, all that responsibility. Do you love it? The question took him off guard. He wasn't used to people asking him things like that. Usually, they just assumed. But Lena wasn't assuming. She genuinely wanted to know. I don't know, he admitted, the words slipping out before he could catch them. I used to think I did. But now, it's complicated. She nodded as if she understood completely. Life tends to get that way, doesn't it? But you've got to figure out what you want. Not what everyone else expects you to do. The simplicity of her statement was striking. It cut through the noise in his head like a knife, clean and sharp. What did he want? That was a question he hadn't let himself ask in a long time. Well, if you ever need a change of scenery, she said with a teasing smile, we're always looking for volunteers. Ethan laughed, the tension easing slightly. I might take you up on that. They stood there for a moment, comfortable in the silence that followed. Ethan looked around the shelter, at the children and volunteers moving in a flurry of activity. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't polished, but it was alive. I should get back to work, Lena said, breaking the moment. But it was good to see you again, Ethan. You too, Lena, he replied. I'll be around. As she turned to walk away, Ethan felt something shift inside him. He wasn't sure what it was exactly, but the world he'd been living in felt suddenly smaller. Lena, with her simple honesty and her grounded sense of purpose, had made him see something he couldn't unsee. Ethan sat in the back of the town car, watching the city pass by in a blur of concrete, glass, and steel. His mother's speech lay in his lap, neatly typed, every word meticulously planned, as though the very future of EcoPower solutions depended on each sentence. But as he read through it for what felt like the 1000th time, the words felt foreign, stiff, and disconnected from the person he wanted to be. The car slowed, approaching the sleek, towering building that housed the investors' offices. Ethan's pulse quickened. This was no ordinary meeting. The stakes were high, major players in the renewable energy sector were waiting inside, ready to decide if EcoPower was worth their trust, and more importantly, their money. "You'll be fine, Ethan," Jenkins said from the front seat, a rare note of encouragement in his voice. Ethan appreciated the gesture, but he wasn't sure if he believed it. He had spent most of his life trying to live up to his mother's expectations, trying to be the person she had meticulously crafted, but today felt different. Something had shifted in him, something subtle but undeniable, and it made the upcoming meeting feel like a crossroads. He stepped out of the car, smoothed his suit, and forced a confident expression as he entered the building. His mind was buzzing, torn between sticking to the safe, carefully prepared speech or risking everything by saying what he truly believed. By the time he reached the conference room, the decision felt heavier than ever. Vivian had already taken her seat at the head of the polished mahogany table, radiating her usual air of authority. She glanced at Ethan, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if sensing his uncertainty. Around the table sat the investors, their faces expectant but unreadable, pens poised over crisp notepads. Ethan took his place at the front, clearing his throat as he opened the folder containing the speech. The first few lines felt like lead on his tongue, scripted and dry. He had practiced them 100 times, yet they didn't sound like him. "Good morning," he began, trying to settle his nerves. "Today, I'm here to present the future of EcoPower Solutions, a company that..." The word stuck in his throat, and for a moment, his mind went blank. He glanced up at the investors, their faces showing no reaction, just polite expectation. He stole a glance at his mother, who was watching him intently, her eyes sharp with warning. Ethan paused, his heart pounding in his chest. The speech in front of him was safe. It was the version of him his mother wanted the world to see, polished, predictable, controlled. But it wasn't real. It wasn't the company he wanted to build. He felt his hand tremble slightly as he closed the folder. Taking a deep breath, he looked up and met the eyes of the investors, one by one. He set the speech aside, pushing it away as though it were something tainted. "Let me start over," he said, his voice more confident now, though his pulse still raced. "I could stand here and read you a well-prepared script about the technical specs of our solar panels and wind turbines. I could talk about profit margins and market share. But if that's all we're offering, I don't think it's enough. Not for this company. Not for the future." A murmur went around the table, soft but noticeable. Vivian shifted in her chair, her fingers tightening around the armrests, her expression unreadable but clearly displeased. "We're at a turning point," Ethan continued, the words coming more naturally now. "Renewable energy is more than just a product. It's a movement. A commitment to changing the way we live, the way we treat our planet, and the way we think about our resources. EcoPower isn't just here to sell solar panels and turbines. We're here to lead that movement. And that means doing more than just building technology. It means building trust. Building partnerships. Building a future where we all thrive, not just as a business, but as a community." One of the investors leaned forward, intrigued. "What do you mean by partnerships, Mr. Marshall?" Ethan's mind flashed to Lena, to the shelter, to the small but real difference she made in her community. That was what mattered. Not just the big players, but the people who needed solutions the most. "We can't just focus on big corporations," he said, meeting the investor's gaze. "We need to partner with communities, with schools, with small businesses. Help them transition to renewable energy, show them that it's not only possible but beneficial. We've already started working on that with local programs, and the results are promising. Lower energy costs, reduced carbon footprints, and more sustainability across the board." He could feel the energy in the room shift, the investors exchanging glances, pens scratching across paper as they made notes. This was the right move, he realized. It was his move. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't just playing the role his mother had written for him, he was speaking from his own vision. One of the women seated across from him, a sharp-eyed executive in her 40s, tapped her pen thoughtfully. "You're talking about a community-driven model. That's a bit of a departure from how your company has operated in the past." Ethan nodded. Exactly. We've built the foundation with large-scale projects, but now it's time to expand our focus. We need to bring renewable energy into every corner of society, not just where it's profitable. We have a responsibility to lead by example. The room was silent for a beat, the tension thick, but the investors' faces now showed something else: interest. When Ethan finally finished, the applause wasn't loud, but it was real. The investors seemed impressed, some nodding in approval. He felt the rush of relief, knowing he had made a real connection. As the meeting wrapped up, Ethan caught Vivian's eye. She hadn't clapped, hadn't moved, hadn't spoken a word. Her silence was deafening. She didn't need to say anything, her disapproval radiated from every inch of her. Once the investors had left, Ethan barely had time to collect his thoughts before Vivian rose from her seat, her face cold and expressionless. "What was that?" she asked, her voice low and controlled. Ethan braced himself. "That was me speaking the truth." "The truth?" she repeated, stepping closer. "The truth is, you just put your reputation and the future of this company at risk with that little improvisation." "What were you thinking?" "I was thinking," Ethan said, his voice firm, "that maybe it's time to stop doing things your way." Vivian's eyes narrowed. "My way is the reason this company exists, Ethan. Don't forget that." But as he stared back at her, Ethan knew something had changed. The cracks in their relationship had started to widen, and this time, he wasn't going to be the one to fill them in. Ethan left the office building with his thoughts swirling, his tie slightly loosened as if it were suffocating him. The tension from the meeting had seeped into his bones. His improvised pitch had gone better than he expected, but Vivian's icy disapproval gnawed at him. She'd barely spoken a word afterward, her silence more cutting than any lecture she could have given. He had spoken his truth, but now, he was left with the fallout, the growing distance between him and his mother, the uncertainty of where his decisions would lead. He walked without a clear direction, his footsteps carrying him away from the polished corporate towers and into the more vibrant part of the city. He needed a break. Needed air that didn't smell like glass offices and boardroom carpets. As he strolled down the bustling sidewalk, his gaze landed on a small cafe tucked between two unremarkable storefronts. The kind of place that wasn't trying too hard, and maybe that's why it drew him in. The bell above the door chimed softly as he stepped inside. It was cozy, filled with mismatched chairs and the soft hum of conversation. The air smelled of freshly brewed coffee and something sweet, probably the pastries cooling behind the counter. Ethan ordered an espresso, needing the sharp jolt of caffeine to clear his head. As he took his seat by the window, his phone buzzed with a message from his secretary, reminding him of a meeting later in the week. He set the phone aside, ignoring it. He wasn't ready to dive back into that world just yet. And then, he saw her. Across the room, sitting at a small table near the back, was Lena. She was flipping through some papers, a half-eaten croissant on a plate beside her. Her hair was pulled back into a low ponytail, strands of it escaping as she concentrated. For a moment, Ethan watched her, surprised by the coincidence. In a city as sprawling as this, what were the chances? He stood, making his way across the room. As if sensing his approach, Lena looked up, her face breaking into a smile when she recognized him. "Well, this is unexpected," she said, leaning back in her chair. "I didn't think I'd see you again so soon." "Same," Ethan said, pulling out the chair across from her. "Mind if I join you?" "Not at all," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "What brings you here? Shouldn't you be in some high-powered meeting or something?" Ethan chuckled softly, though the weight of the morning still lingered in his chest. "I just needed to clear my head, honestly. The meeting's over, but it didn't exactly go the way I expected." Lena raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Good or bad?" "Both, I guess," Ethan admitted, taking a sip of his coffee. "It was supposed to be simple. Stick to the script, make everyone happy. But I couldn't do it. So, I went off script, told them what I really think about the direction of the company. It went over well with the investors, but my mother, not so much. Sounds like a big step, Lena said, her voice soft but thoughtful. It's not easy to break away from what people expect of you. Ethan nodded. Yeah, and now I'm stuck wondering if I made the right call. Lena leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. I think you did. It's your company too, isn't it? You should be able to shape it the way you believe it should be. Her words, so simple and direct, felt like a balm to the unease gnawing at him. For someone who had spent so much time in his carefully curated world, hearing someone speak with such clarity was refreshing. He watched her for a moment, noticing the quiet strength in the way she spoke, the way she carried herself without pretense. What about you? Ethan asked, shifting the conversation away from his own troubles. How's everything going at the shelter? Lena smiled, a spark of enthusiasm lighting her eyes. It's going well. Busy, as always. But I've been thinking about expanding, starting some new programs to help the kids once they age out of the system. There's so much more we could be doing, but we need resources, funding, volunteers, things like that. Ethan's interest peaked. What kind of programs? Job training, mostly, Lena explained, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her coffee cup. A lot of these kids don't have a clear path once they're out on their own. If we could set them up with skills that'll help them get good jobs, it could change their lives. I've been reaching out to local businesses, seeing if anyone's willing to partner with us, but it's slow going. Her passion was unmistakable, and Ethan found himself drawn in by her determination. Lena wasn't just talking about solving problems in the abstract, she was living it. She was on the front lines, fighting for change in a way that was tangible, real. That's incredible, he said, meaning every word. If there's anything I can do to help, let me know. Lena tilted her head, giving him a curious look. You mean that? Absolutely, Ethan replied. I might be able to introduce you to a few people, maybe help secure some funding for the programs. My company's been looking to get more involved with community outreach, and this sounds like exactly the kind of initiative we should be supporting. A smile tugged at the corners of her lips. I'll hold you to that. They fell into an easy conversation after that, talking about everything from the shelter's challenges to the broader issues of inequality and the environment. Lena's perspective was refreshing, uncomplicated but not naive, driven by a sincere desire to make things better. For the first time in what felt like ages, Ethan wasn't talking business strategies or market shares. He was talking about something that mattered. As their conversation wound down, an idea began to form in his mind. Hey, he said, almost hesitantly. We're having a company gala next week. It's not really my kind of thing, but it could be a great opportunity to meet some people who might be able to help with the shelter. You should come. Lena blinked, clearly surprised by the invitation. A gala? Like, a fancy party? Yeah, Ethan said, rubbing the back of his neck. It's a bit over the top, honestly, but there will be a lot of influential people there. People who could make a real difference for your programs. I could introduce you to some of them. She seemed to consider it for a moment before nodding slowly. Okay. Why not? I'll go. Great, Ethan said, relieved. I'll make sure everything's set. You won't regret it. Lena smiled again, but there was a glimmer of something unreadable in her eyes. Just don't be surprised if I show up in something a little less glamorous than the usual crowd. Ethan laughed, waving her off. I think you'll fit in just fine. Lena stood outside the grand entrance of the hotel, her fingers tightening around the small clutch she carried. The tall, imposing building loomed above her, every inch of it oozing opulence and wealth. She glanced down at the dress Ethan had sent over the day before, a simple but elegant navy blue gown that hugged her frame without being too revealing. It wasn't flashy, but it was classy, and she had felt beautiful when she put it on. Now, standing among a sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, she felt like a child trying to wear her mother's clothes. She took a deep breath and straightened her posture, trying to shake off the nerves. This wasn't her world, but she wasn't here to impress anyone. She was here to support Ethan and maybe, just maybe, make some valuable connections for the shelter. That was all. Lena approached the entrance, offering a polite smile to the event staff at the door. A young woman with a clipboard glanced at her, then backed down at the list in her hand. Your name, please? Lena, she replied, her voice steady. I'm with Ethan Marshall. The woman's brow furrowed as she scanned the list, her finger trailing down the page. After a moment, she looked back up, her expression apologetic but firm. I'm sorry, ma'am, but you're not on the guest list. Lena's stomach dropped. There must be a mistake. Ethan invited me himself. The woman's expression softened, but her voice remained impassive. I'm sorry, but if your name's not on the list, I can't let you in. Lena felt the heat rise to her cheeks, the embarrassment prickling at her skin. The people around her continued to glide into the event, the men handing off their coats to the staff, the women laughing and talking in clusters as they walked through the glittering doors. It was as though she didn't belong, not even close. There must be a mistake, Lena repeated, though her voice lacked the conviction it had before. Could you check with Ethan? He's inside. I can't leave the entrance, ma'am, the woman said, her tone now more clipped, growing impatient with each second Lena stood there. And I can't allow anyone in who's not on the list. I'm very sorry. Lena's mind scrambled for a solution, but nothing came. She could feel the eyes of the people around her, glancing at her with polite confusion. She felt small. Out of place. And worst of all, she felt foolish for thinking she could walk into this world and be accepted. I should go, Lena murmured, stepping back from the entrance. The humiliation was sinking in now, cold and sharp. She turned away quickly, avoiding the curious glances and whispers that seemed to follow her. She didn't want to call Ethan. Didn't want to cause a scene. Maybe she didn't belong in his life after all. Inside the ballroom, Ethan was scanning the room, looking for Lena. She was supposed to have arrived by now, and the gala was in full swing. The room was packed with investors, board members, and every person of influence in the city. The chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting a warm, golden glow over the sea of tuxedos and designer gowns. Ethan should have felt at ease here. It was the kind of event he had attended all his life, but his mind was elsewhere, preoccupied with Lena. Ethan, came a voice behind him, smooth and familiar. He turned to see his mother, Vivian, approaching him with a champagne flute in hand. She wore an emerald green gown, tailored to perfection, her expression one of cool control as always. There you are, she said, her lips curving into a practiced smile. Mingling, I hope? The Wexler group is here. It would be good to make an impression. Ethan nodded absently, barely listening. Have you seen Lena? She should have been here by now. Vivian's smile faltered, just slightly. I'm sure she'll be here. If not, well, she trailed off, her tone dismissive, as though Lena's presence was an afterthought. I'll be back, Ethan said, not waiting for a response. He moved through the crowd, scanning the room again. His worry grew as the minutes ticked by, and still, there was no sign of her. He pulled out his phone, sending her a quick message. Where are you? His phone remained silent, and a knot of unease tightened in his gut. Minutes passed, and his frustration built. Finally, he flagged down one of the event staff. Have you seen a woman named Lena? She was supposed to be on the guest list. The staff member hesitated, his eyes darting toward the entrance. I believe someone by that name was turned away earlier, sir. She wasn't on the list. Ethan's heart sank, the knot in his chest turning to cold dread. Turned away? She wouldn't have just left without telling him. Unless. He didn't want to think about it, but the truth was beginning to settle like a stone in his gut. His mother. This had her fingerprints all over it. Without another word, Ethan pushed through the crowd, his jaw clenched as he sought out Vivian. When he found her, she was standing by a group of investors, laughing lightly at some small joke. But Ethan didn't care about the facade she was putting on. Vivian, he said sharply, causing her to look up in mild surprise. What did you do? Vivian raised an eyebrow, clearly unbothered by his tone. Ethan, what are you talking about? Lena, he said, his voice low but seething. She wasn't on the guest list. You had her name removed, didn't you? Vivian's smile remained, but her eyes flashed with irritation. Ethan, this is hardly the time. Answer me, he demanded, his voice louder now. People were starting to glance their way, sensing the tension. Vivian sighed, setting down her champagne glass with exaggerated grace. Yes, I had her name removed. It was for your own good, Ethan. These events are about making connections, about aligning yourself with the right people. And she simply doesn't belong in this world. Ethan's blood boiled, his fists clenching at his sides. She doesn't belong, he repeated, incredulous. Do you even hear yourself? You humiliated her. You humiliated me. Vivian's eyes hardened. You're too emotional. This is business. Lena is a distraction. You need to focus on what's important. And you think you get to decide what's important? Ethan shot back, his voice filled with barely controlled rage. You think you get to decide who's good enough for me? This isn't about business, Mom. This is about you controlling everything in my life. Ethan, don't be naive, she said coolly. You're too close to see it now, but you'll thank me later. He stared at her, the woman who had shaped every part of his life, and in that moment, all he saw was someone who had crossed a line she could never uncross. Without another word, Ethan turned and walked away, ignoring the stares, ignoring his mother's icy gaze. He didn't care about the gala, about the investors, about any of it. He needed to find Lena. The next morning, Ethan paced the length of his living room, the tension still thrumming in his veins. He hadn't been able to sleep, his mind a storm of anger, regret, and the lingering image of Lena's face when she realized she wasn't on the guest list. The humiliation she must have felt, because of his mother's pettiness, her need to control everything, made his stomach churn. He stopped, running a hand through his hair as his thoughts collided. He had left the gala without a second thought, heading straight to Lena's apartment. But by the time he arrived, she was gone, the lights off, no answer at the door. He had tried calling her, texting her, but nothing. It wasn't hard to understand why she didn't want to talk to him. He couldn't blame her. Vivian's interference had gone too far. It was bad enough when she controlled his business decisions, but now, she was pulling strings in his personal life. Ethan had spent years trying to live up to her expectations, trying to be the perfect son, the perfect executive. But last night had made it clear that he couldn't keep living like this. He glanced at his phone, the screen lighting up with a message from his secretary. Another meeting reminder. Another demand. Another step down the path his mother had laid out for him. He turned the phone off, shoving it into his pocket before grabbing his keys. It was time to confront her. When Ethan arrived at the estate, the tension in his chest grew tighter. The sprawling house, with its manicured lawns and perfect symmetry, looked like a monument to his mother's control. Everything about it screamed discipline, order, and an almost suffocating perfection. He hated it, and yet it was where he had grown up, where every decision about his life had been shaped. He entered the house without knocking, pushing open the heavy wooden doors. Vivian was in the living room, seated on one of the high-backed chairs near the fireplace, a cup of tea in her hand. She looked up as he entered, her expression cool and unbothered, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. "Ethan," she said, her voice crisp, betraying no emotion. "I wasn't expecting you." He didn't bother with pleasantries. "We need to talk." Vivian raised a brow, setting her teacup down with a delicate clink. "About what, exactly?" "About last night," Ethan said, his tone sharp. "About you having Lena's name taken off the guest list." Vivian let out a soft, dismissive sigh, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Ah, that. That? Ethan repeated, his voice rising. That's all you have to say? You humiliated her, and you humiliated me. I did what needed to be done, Vivian replied, her tone cold and measured. You may not see it now, but I was protecting you. Protecting your reputation. Ethan stared at her, disbelief washing over him. My reputation? You think I care about what those people think of me? Of Lena? You should, Vivian snapped, standing now, her composure slipping. This is about more than just you, Ethan. You have responsibilities. To this family. To this company. You can't just bring someone like her into that world and expect everything to be fine. She's not one of us. One of us? Ethan repeated, the words hitting him like a slap. Is that what this is about? Status? Money? You think because she works at a shelter, she's somehow beneath you? She's beneath you, Vivian said coldly, her eyes hardening. And whether you like it or not, your choices reflect on this family. On eco power. You have no idea what you're risking by associating with someone like her. Ethan felt the anger rising in him, hot and uncontrollable. You don't get to make those decisions for me. Not anymore. Vivian's eyes flashed, but she didn't back down. You think you can just walk away? From me? From the company? I'm not walking away from the company, Ethan said, his voice steady despite the fire raging inside him. I'm going to run it. My way. Vivian let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Run it? You think you can run eco power without me? You're nothing without this family, Ethan. Without my support. You've been coasting on privilege your entire life. You've never had to fight for anything. Never had to build anything yourself. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to argue, but the truth in her accusation made him hesitate. She wasn't entirely wrong. His life, his career, had been paved by his family's wealth and influence. Every opportunity, every success had come with strings attached, and those strings all led back to her. I own the majority of this company, Vivian continued, her voice cutting through the silence. You wouldn't last a month without my backing. Do you really think you can do this on your own? That you can survive outside of this life I've built for you? Ethan's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. I'm not asking for your permission, he said, his voice low and deadly serious. I'm telling you. I'm done letting you control everything. The business, my life. All of it. Vivian's face twisted into something darker, more vicious than he had ever seen. You're nothing but a spoiled child, Ethan. A boy playing at being a man. You think you can break away from me? From this family? You'll come crawling back, just like you always do. The sting of her words settled in his chest, but this time, they didn't knock him down. They solidified something inside him, a determination he hadn't known he possessed until now. I'd rather fail on my own, Ethan said, his voice steady, than succeed under your thumb. Vivian's eyes widened, just for a moment, before the mask of control slipped back into place. She stared at him, her lips pressed into a thin line, before turning away, dismissing him with a flick of her hand. Do as you please, Ethan, she said coldly. But don't expect me to pick up the pieces when you fall apart. Ethan stood there, feeling the weight of everything he was walking away from. The safety net. The power. The money. But as he turned to leave, something else filled the space that fear had once occupied. Freedom. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the early morning light streaming through the windows. His mind was a whirlwind, racing in a dozen different directions, each thought louder and more insistent than the last. The events of the previous day, the confrontation with his mother, echoed in his head, replaying every stinging word she had thrown at him. You're nothing without this family. You've never had to fight for anything. Each sentence cut deep, gnawing at the fragile sense of self he had spent years pretending to believe in. Vivian's words had always been sharp, but never had they shaken him like this. For the first time, he had stood up to her, and in doing so, he had exposed the cracks in the foundation of the life he'd been living. Everything he thought he'd built, his success, his reputation, wasn't really his. It had always been her behind the curtain, pulling the strings. He ran his hands through his hair, letting out a deep, frustrated breath. Who was he without eco-power? Without the martial name propping him up? He had spent years believing he was the driving force behind the company's growth, but now, he wasn't so sure. Maybe his mother was right. Maybe he was just a spoiled brat playing at being a CEO. The thought made his stomach churn. For years, Ethan had gone along with the plan. He'd followed the path laid out for him, trusting that his mother knew what was best for both him and the company. But now, standing at this crossroads, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been living someone else's life. Every decision, every step forward had been guided by her hand. And now that he had pulled away from her, now that he was free to make his own choices, he didn't know where to begin. He glanced at his phone on the nightstand, his finger hovering over the contact list. He could call someone, an investor, a business partner, ask for advice. But that's what he'd always done, leaned on the network his family had built. Every time he had been in trouble, there had been someone there to cushion the fall. No more. If he was going to do this, it had to be on his own. Ethan stood abruptly, pacing the length of his bedroom as if walking would somehow help him sort through the mess in his mind. His reflection in the mirror caught his attention, and for the first time in years, he didn't recognize the man staring back at him. The suit, the polished shoes, the air of confidence, it all felt like a costume. A role he had been playing for too long. He stripped off the jacket and threw it onto the bed. This wasn't him. Not anymore. As the hours dragged by, he found himself at his desk, his laptop open in front of him, staring at the email draft he had been agonizing over for the last hour. His resignation letter. The words felt foreign as he typed them out, like he was cutting ties with a part of himself he didn't fully understand. But it was necessary. He couldn't stay at eco-power, not under his mother's shadow. The cursor blinked, taunting him. Finally, with a deep breath, he hit send. It was done. No going back now. The moment the email disappeared into cyberspace, a strange sense of relief washed over him. It was terrifying, stepping away from everything he had known, but there was also a freedom in it. For the first time in his life, he was on his own. And that was both exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. But now came the hard part. What was next? He needed to build something for himself, something that had nothing to do with his family's legacy. But where would he even begin? His mind drifted back to the conversation he'd had with Lena at the cafe, her passion for helping those who had been overlooked by the system, her plans to expand the shelter's reach and bring sustainable solutions to the community. She had spoken with such clarity, such purpose. Ethan had admired that about her, how she knew exactly what she wanted to do, and more importantly, why. Sustainable energy. That was where his passion still lay, wasn't it? Not just in the big, corporate ventures, but in making a tangible difference. Helping people who didn't have the resources to invest in green energy, who needed solutions that would actually benefit them. There was something there, something real. His mind raced as the idea started to form. He could start his own consulting business, one focused on helping small businesses and nonprofits implement green energy solutions. Not just the big corporations, but the ones who were often left out of the conversation. The shelters, the schools, the community centers that needed help the most. It was a bold idea, but it felt right. It felt like something he could believe in. He grabbed his phone, scrolling through his contacts, finding names of people he had worked with in the industry. He had the connections, the knowledge. All he had to do was reach out, start the conversation. And for the first time, it wouldn't be his mother's network, it would be his. The people he had built relationships with on his own terms. Ethan started making calls, sending emails, laying the groundwork for something new. As the day went on, his confidence grew. There were risks, of course. He wouldn't have the safety net of EcoPower's resources, but that was the point. He didn't want the safety net. He wanted to build something that was his, something that mattered. By late afternoon, he had already set up meetings with a handful of potential clients, small businesses, nonprofits, people who were interested in sustainability but didn't have the resources or the expertise to make it happen. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He glanced at the clock, realizing that hours had passed without him even noticing. For the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of excitement, the kind that came from doing something that was truly yours. His thoughts drifted back to Lena. She had been the catalyst for this change, even if she didn't know it. Her passion, her belief in doing something meaningful, had pushed him to take this leap. He needed to find her, to explain everything that had happened, and to show her that he was serious about changing his life. The day was bright, with sunlight streaming through the large windows of their small apartment, casting a golden glow on the freshly painted walls. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open in front of him, the remnants of his morning coffee cooling beside the keyboard. His inbox was full, but this time, it wasn't the corporate memos or high-stakes investor meetings he'd been used to. Instead, it was inquiries from small businesses and nonprofits looking for help in implementing sustainable energy solutions, his clients, his work, his future. He glanced up when he heard the door creak open, and Lena stepped into the room, her hair still damp from the shower, dressed in jeans and a soft sweater. Her smile was warm, and just seeing her eased some of the tension that had built up in his shoulders. "Good morning," she said, walking over to press a quick kiss to the top of his head. "Morning," Ethan replied, leaning back in his chair to look at her. "You're up early. I thought you didn't have to be at the shelter until noon." Lena shrugged, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "I couldn't sleep in. Too much on my mind." Ethan smiled knowingly. There was always a lot on her mind, between the shelter's endless needs, the expansion project she was working on, and now, their new life together. It was hard to blame her. It had been just over 6 months since their wedding, a small and intimate affair, nothing like the extravagant Marshall family events he had grown up with. It had been simple, beautiful, and perfect. They had started their life together in this modest apartment, a far cry from the sprawling Marshall estate or the luxurious penthouses of his past, but it was theirs. Every piece of furniture, every decision, every corner of the space had been crafted by them. It wasn't much, but it was home. "How's the shelter project going?" Ethan asked, watching as Lena sat down across from him, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug. "It's moving," she said with a sigh. "Slowly, but it's moving. We're still struggling to get enough funding to cover the new training program, but we're close. If we can lock down the grant from the city, we'll be in a good place." Ethan reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "You'll get it. They'd be crazy not to back you." Lena smiled, her eyes softening. "I hope so. I'm just trying to make it work. But between the shelter and everything else, some days it feels like I'm barely keeping my head above water." Ethan understood that feeling all too well. His own consulting business had been a challenge from the start. Without the cushion of his family's money or the vast resources of EcoPower, there had been days when he had wondered if he'd made the right decision. Clients came slowly at first, and the financial strain had been real. They'd had to make sacrifices, cut corners, but they had done it together. His network had proved invaluable, and soon, word had spread. Small businesses and nonprofits, those often ignored by the big energy corporations, were turning to him for guidance. His hard work was paying off, but it hadn't been easy. And now, as the business grew, he finally felt like he was building something that was truly his. "How's everything on your end?" Lena asked, interrupting his thoughts. "It's going well," Ethan said, glancing at the open email on his laptop. "I'm meeting with a couple of new clients next week. Both nonprofits that want to go solar. If I can close these deals, it'll be a good step forward." "I knew you'd make this work," Lena said softly, her smile widening. "I always believed in you." Ethan's heart swelled. Lena had been his rock throughout the entire journey. Even on the hard days, when doubt crept in, she had been there, reminding him that he wasn't alone, that they were in this together. He squeezed her hand again, about to say something, when Lena shifted in her chair, her expression changing slightly. "I've been meaning to tell you something," she said, her voice quieter now. Ethan's brow furrowed as he looked at her, the concern rising in his chest. "What's going on?" Lena bit her lip, her eyes meeting his with a mix of excitement and nerves. "I found out a couple of days ago. I'm pregnant." For a moment, the world seemed to freeze, the words hanging in the air between them. Ethan blinked, the surprise washing over him before it was replaced by a rush of pure joy. "You're pregnant?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Lena nodded, her smile growing as she watched the realization sink in. "Yes." Ethan stood, his chair scraping against the floor as he rounded the table to pull her into his arms. He held her tight, the weight of what she had just told him settling in his chest like warmth spreading through him. "We're going to have a baby?" he said again, the grin on his face widening as he pulled back to look at her. Lena laughed, tears shining in her eyes as she nodded. "Yes, Ethan. We're going to have a baby." He pressed his forehead to hers, his heart pounding in his chest. "I can't believe it. This is amazing." "It is," Lena said, her voice soft and full of emotion. "I'm a little terrified, though." Ethan chuckled, pulling her closer. "Me too. But we'll figure it out. We always do." They stood there for a while, wrapped in each other, letting the enormity of the news settle between them. It wasn't just the two of them anymore. Their family was growing, and with it, their life was expanding in ways they had never imagined. "We need to celebrate," Ethan said, pulling back with a grin. "Tonight. Dinner at your favorite restaurant. We'll make it official." Lena laughed, wiping away a stray tear. "I like that idea. But nothing too fancy. You know we're still watching the budget." Ethan smiled, brushing a kiss against her temple. "It will be all right." Vivian Marshall sat alone in the grand sitting room of her estate, the silence pressing in around her like an unwanted companion. The gilded chandeliers hung motionless, their crystal reflections casting a cold light on the spotless floors. The house, once bustling with dinner parties, important meetings, and the rhythm of life, felt empty now, hollow. She stared at the envelope in her hand, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened the letter again. She had read it twice already, but the words on the paper still hit her like a sledgehammer. A simple note from an acquaintance, someone from her high society circle, letting her know that her son, Ethan, and his wife Lena were expecting a baby. Her first grandchild. Vivian swallowed hard, her throat tight, the words blurring before her eyes. She had always expected to be there when this moment came. She had imagined the day she would meet her first grandchild, hold them in her arms, be a part of their life, guiding them, just as she had guided Ethan. But the reality was far from that vision. Ethan and Lena had kept their distance from her, ever since that night at the gala, the night she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Her grip on Ethan's life had been so tight for so long, she hadn't noticed it slipping until it was too late. Now, he was gone, living his life on his own terms, and Vivian was left standing in the ruins of a relationship she had once controlled completely. Her son was married, building a life with Lena, and she had no part in it. The ache in her chest grew stronger, a bitter mixture of loneliness and regret. How had it come to this? The echoes of her past decisions, the harsh words she had thrown at Ethan, played over in her mind like a broken record. "You're nothing without this family. You've never built anything on your own." At the time, she had believed those words, believed that Ethan needed her guidance, her control, to be successful. But now, she saw it for what it was, a desperate attempt to hold on to him, to keep him in the world she had carefully crafted. Her world. A world that had grown cold and empty, with only her pride and stubbornness for company. Vivian set the letter down on the table, her fingers brushing over the smooth surface of the polished wood. A tear slipped down her cheek, though she quickly wiped it away, angry at herself for being so weak. She had never allowed herself to be vulnerable, not even to her own son. Vulnerability was a weakness, and weakness was something she had never tolerated in others, let alone in herself. But as she sat in the oppressive quiet of her home, the realization settled over her like a heavy blanket: she was alone. Truly alone. And if she didn't change something, if she didn't find a way to mend what she had broken, she would never know her grandchild. The thought was unbearable. Could she even fix this? Was there still time to reconcile with Ethan? Would he ever forgive her? Vivian stood abruptly, the motion sending a ripple through the stillness of the room. She couldn't sit here any longer, wallowing in her regret. She needed to do something, to reach out, to at least try. Whether Ethan would listen or not, she owed him that much. She owed him an apology for everything she had done, for the way she had tried to control him, the way she had pushed Lena out of his life. She had to face the truth: she had been wrong. She crossed the room to her desk, pulling out a piece of stationery and a pen. The words came slowly at first, but as she wrote, the weight in her chest seemed to lift, just slightly. Ethan. I know it has been a long time since we last spoke, and I know that much of that is my fault. I can't change what I've done, and I won't make excuses for my behavior. I only want you to know how deeply I regret how I've treated you, and Lena. I've spent too much time trying to control you, trying to mold you into the person I thought you should be, without realizing that you didn't need me to do that. You are your own person, and I should have seen that sooner. I've heard the news. Congratulations on the baby. I cannot tell you how much I want to be a part of your life and your child's life. I know I don't deserve that right now, but I'm asking, as your mother, for a chance to make things right. Please, Ethan, let me be a part of this new chapter. With love. Mother. Vivian folded the letter carefully, sliding it into an envelope. She stared at it for a moment before sealing it and setting it aside. She could send it by email, but this felt more personal, more tangible. She wanted him to feel the sincerity in her words, not just read them on a screen. The letter was a start, but she knew it might not be enough. She couldn't undo the past with a few words on paper. But she hoped it would at least open the door to a conversation, a chance for her to show Ethan that she had changed, that she was willing to listen now, willing to be the mother he needed her to be. The next few days were a blur of waiting. Every time the phone rang or a message pinged, her heart jumped into her throat, but it was never Ethan. The silence was deafening, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. But she forced herself to be patient. Then, one evening, just as the light outside was fading, her phone buzzed. She reached for it with trembling hands, her breath catching in her chest when she saw Ethan's name flash on the screen. The message was brief. Let's meet. Tomorrow, noon. The cafe on Green Street. Vivian's hands shook as she set the phone down. He had agreed to meet. There was a chance, after all. The air in the cafe was warm, carrying the scent of fresh coffee and pastries, but the atmosphere between Ethan and Vivian was heavy with unspoken words. Ethan sat across from his mother, watching her closely, his expression unreadable. For the first time in years, Vivian felt exposed, vulnerable. She had spent a lifetime controlling everything around her, but now, sitting across from her son, she realized how little control she truly had. Vivian cleared her throat, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Ethan, I've made so many mistakes. Her voice trembled, a stark contrast to the composed persona she usually presented. I pushed you away. I tried to control everything, even your happiness, and I see now that I was wrong. I never wanted to hurt you or Lena, but I did. Ethan's eyes softened, but his face remained guarded. He had heard apologies before, but this time, something about his mother's tone felt different. There was no pretense, no defense. Just a raw admission of guilt. Why now? He asked, his voice quiet but firm. Why are you apologizing now? Vivian took a deep breath, the weight of her regret heavy on her chest. Because I don't want to lose you. I don't want to miss out on your life, or your child's life. When I heard that Lena was pregnant, it hit me. I might never know my grandchild. I might never be a part of their life, and that terrified me. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for a chance to try. Ethan's expression shifted, the hardness in his eyes beginning to melt away. He glanced down at his hands, processing her words. Lena and I have built a life together, he said slowly. A life that we've had to fight for. I walked away from everything to make something on my own, to prove that I could stand without relying on you or the family. You need to understand that if we let you into our lives, it's going to be on our terms. Vivian nodded, her eyes filling with unshed tears. I understand, she whispered. I just want to be a part of your life, however you'll let me. I'm not asking to control anything. I just want my family back. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest as he considered her words. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when his mother finally acknowledged that her way wasn't the only way, that she had made mistakes. He wasn't ready to forget the past, but maybe, just maybe, he was ready to let her in. Okay, he said after a long pause. But this is going to be different. No more controlling. No more interference. If we let you into our lives, it's because you're willing to accept us as we are. Vivian's relief was palpable. Thank you, Ethan. I promise, I'll do whatever it takes. The months that followed were a slow, careful process of rebuilding. Vivian, true to her word, made an effort to be involved in Ethan and Lena's life without overstepping. It wasn't easy for her, old habits died hard, but each day, she learned a little more about how to let go. When Lena's due date drew closer, Vivian found herself visiting more often, her excitement about becoming a grandmother growing with each passing week. At first, Lena had been cautious, unsure if Vivian's change of heart was genuine. But over time, as they spent more time together, she saw a different side of Vivian, a softer, more willing to learn side. The day the baby was born was a quiet, beautiful moment. Ethan and Lena welcomed a healthy baby girl into the world, and when Vivian held her granddaughter for the first time, something shifted in her heart. As she looked down at the tiny bundle in her arms, she felt a love that transcended everything else, the kind of love that softened her sharp edges and reminded her of the importance of family. They named the baby Esme, and from the moment she entered the world, she brought joy and healing to everyone around her. Vivian's transformation from a controlling matriarch to a devoted grandmother didn't happen overnight, but it was steady and genuine. She began spending more time with Lena, learning to appreciate the quiet strength of her daughter-in-law. Despite Lena's humble upbringing, she was a devoted mother, always looking out for Esme's best interests. Vivian admired how Lena instinctively knew what Esme needed, how she balanced the demands of motherhood with her continued work at the shelter. At first, Vivian had been unsure of how to contribute without stepping on toes. She wasn't used to offering help without taking control. But slowly, she learned. She started small, offering to babysit while Ethan and Lena attended to their work. Lena hesitated at first, but as Vivian proved herself reliable and respectful of their parenting choices, trust grew. Soon, Vivian found herself volunteering at the shelter on weekends, helping organize fundraisers and offering her time in ways she hadn't imagined before. She didn't do it to impress anyone, she did it because she saw how much it meant to Lena. And in the process, she discovered that helping others, even in small ways, brought her a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in years. Weekends turned into family days, with Vivian planning activities for Esme that allowed Ethan and Lena some much-needed alone time. Whether it was a trip to the park or a quiet afternoon of baking cookies, Vivian cherished every moment with her granddaughter. Watching Esme grow, seeing the joy in her eyes, brought a light back into Vivian's life that she hadn't realized she was missing. One warm summer afternoon, as the family sat in the backyard of Ethan and Lena's modest home, watching Esme toddle around the garden, Vivian felt a profound sense of peace. It wasn't the grand estate or the social circles that mattered anymore. It was these moments of connection, of family, of love. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the backyard, Vivian felt a quiet contentment settle over her. She had found her place in their lives, not as the one in control, but as part of a family where love and understanding had finally bridged the gaps that had once seemed insurmountable.